In the wake of the leaked Supreme Court draft overturning Roe v. Wade, abortion rights activists called for a summer of rage. Shortly after the leak, a video was released, narrated by actress Alyssa Milano and entitled "The History of Abortion." This video claims to drop some big truth bombs, revealing who is really behind the effort to take away women's freedom to control their own bodies. Spoiler alert, in case you haven't seen the video, the answer is white men. This video is a response. The actual history of abortion is more nuanced than the writers of Milano's video admit. I'll provide you with some sourced information that tells a different story, and you can decide for yourself which is true. The video's first claim is that, quote, contraception and abortion were both legal in what became the U.S. as far back as the 1600s. Abortion was allowed by law until around 16 weeks. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that the medical establishment began a campaign to shift reproductive health care away from midwives, away from women, and toward an institution of almost exclusively male obstetricians and gynecologists, end quote. This claim is basically true. What is misleading is the implied motive behind the campaign. Why was abortion originally allowed until around 16 weeks? The answer is quickening, which is the point at which a mother can first feel fetal movement. Quickening can occur as early as 16 weeks. It was widely accepted that quickening signified the beginning of life in the womb. It was assumed that before quickening, the fetus was not yet alive. In other words, this long-standing belief was based on ignorance of the human reproductive process. It was the advent of cell theory in 1839 that caused thinking to change. Cell theory clarified the equivalent and complementary nature of male and female sex cells, shedding new light on the process of human reproduction. Scientists realized that the fetus was a living entity before quickening. It was this new and more accurate medical science that led the newly formed American Medical Association to move to criminalize abortion in 1857. Not because a cabal of white men wanted to take away women's freedom, as Milano claims. In fact, it was for this same reason, during this same period, that many of the first feminists, the suffragists, were also outspokenly anti-abortion. According to Feminists for Life, there is not a single known suffragette feminist who was pro-legal abortion. Some saw motherhood as one of womanhood's greatest gifts and were graphically opposed to abortion, speaking out against treating a developing fetus as property that could be destroyed. For similar reasons, these early feminists were also abolitionists, speaking out against treating slaves as property. So, the early anti-abortion movement was not an exclusively male enterprise based on sexism. See links in the description below for more info. The video's second claim involves a fascinating debate. Milano claims that the campaign to criminalize abortion was, quote, led in part by the father of modern gynecology, J Marion Sims, infamous for forcing experimental medical procedures on enslaved black women without anesthesia, end quote. After a disgusted, pregnant pause, Milano then claims, yeah, that happened. But it's not clear that happened, at least not in the callous, proto-Nazi way that she implies. There is an academic debate around Sims. He did indeed perform experimental surgery without anesthesia on enslaved women. The main problem is with her use of the word forced. There is good reason to believe that these women were willing participants. And Sims was not performing random, non-therapeutic experiments on women. He was specifically seeking a cure for an incurable condition called vesicovaginal fistula. This condition was caused by damaged tissue between the vagina and bladder, resulting in lifelong, continual urine and sometimes fecal leakage, accompanied by pain, constant odor, recurring infections, and other complications. Women with this injury essentially became social outcasts. Sims housed several slave women with this condition behind his house in Alabama for nearly 4 years, performing surgeries until he succeeded in developing a successful surgical treatment. Sims explicitly wrote that he obtained the full consent of his patients. He even claims to have trained some of the enslaved women who would then assist him in operating on the other women in search of a cure. But why didn't he use anesthesia? Some charged that he was a racist who didn't believe black women could feel pain. Well, the timeline of events is critical. The field of anesthesia was new and still regarded with caution or even suspicion among many physicians. Sims started performing his experiments in 1845. It so happens that the anesthetic properties of ether were not publicly demonstrated until the following year, and its acceptance was not immediately universal. Some modern critics object that when he later moved to New York, Sims performed the same surgery on white women whom he did sedate. But during this same period, in a lecture to the New York Academy of Medicine given in 1857, he claimed that he never used anesthesia in fistula operations because, quote, they are not painful enough to justify the trouble and risk attending their administration, end quote. What does the Sims debate have to do with abortion? Nothing, except that the writers of the video want to associate the criminalizing of abortion with Sims because they believe him to be a reprehensible anti-woman white male. Sims has now mostly been canceled as a revered historic figure. But the primary figure who led the campaign to criminalize abortion in 1857 wasn't Sims. It was a pro-life activist doctor named Horatio Storer, a Harvard Medical School grad who was one of the first doctors to successfully perform a cesarean section. Storer based his anti-abortion campaign on the recent realization that a new life begins at conception. The AMA adopted Storer's science-based position on abortion in 1859. Sims did not become president of the AMA for another 17 years, well after the Civil War. Was J Marion Sims a hero or a villain? No one today can say for sure. Did these guys have some sexist and or racist attitudes? Probably. It was the 1800s. But it is an undisputed fact that Sims developed the world's first successful fistula treatment, giving back afflicted women their bodily autonomy. To read a credible account of both sides of the Sims debate, see the linked article by the NIH in the description below. The video's next error is pretty serious, in part because it is so frequently repeated in the abortion debate. Milano states, quote, by the late 1800s, abortion was made illegal in the United States of America. What did that mean for women? Well, almost 3,000 of us forced to undergo illegal abortions started dying each year, end quote. We don't know what the video writer's source for this number is because no sources are given throughout the video. At any rate, it's impossible to know the true number of incidents for an illegal procedure done in secret. Some sources estimate the yearly death toll to be over 10,000 in the early years of illegalization. As recently as 2018 to 2019, Planned Parenthood's then president, Dr. Leana Wen, repeatedly referred to thousands of women dying every year before Roe. Any loss of life for women who see no other option than abortion is tragic. However, what we do know is that the number of deaths from illegal abortions dropped precipitously with the widespread introduction of antibiotic drugs and penicillin after World War II, along with improved contraception methods. By 1959, Planned Parenthood's medical director, Mary Steichen Calderon, could say, quote, "Abortion is no longer a dangerous procedure. This applies not just to therapeutic abortions as performed in hospitals, but also to so-called illegal abortions as done by physicians. In 1957, there were only 260 deaths in the whole country attributed to abortions of any kind. In New York City in 1921, before antibiotics, there were 144 abortion deaths. In 1951, there were only 15." End quote. The CDC didn't begin tracking abortion deaths until 1972, the year before Roe. The CDC's finding for the entire U.S. that year: 24 deaths from legal abortions, 39 deaths from illegal abortions. So, not thousands each year. Just to provide perspective, and certainly not to trivialize those deaths, more people are killed by falling coconuts each year. The final claim I want to address pertains to the narrative that white men want to control women's bodies, that there is a decades-long war against women, and that violent pro-life men have been carrying out this war. Milano claims, quote, "But as soon as Roe v. Wade is passed, the movement against reproductive freedom took one look at all of those women happily controlling their own bodies, going to college, and dynamically entering the workforce, and they said, 'Oh, hell no.' The anti-choice movement went into full gear, and it hasn't let up since. Conservative Catholics, newly radicalized evangelical Christians, and far-right legislators immediately convened in Washington, D.C. in a mission to politicize abortion, strip women of their constitutional right to privacy, and ultimately overturn Roe." End quote. Okay, this did not happen. This is somebody's imagination. Let's look at some history. While it's true that conservative Catholics had always been pro-life, evangelicals as a whole were late to the game. It took several years for most evangelicals to care much about abortion. The only significant 1973 pro-life convening in Washington, D.C. that I'm aware of was led by a woman, a lawyer named Nellie Gray, and it was not an immediate convening. Gray met with 30 pro-lifers in her living room in October, not January, to organize a march for the upcoming January. According to marchforlife.org, she specifically called for the meeting because she feared the one-year anniversary of Roe would come and go with no public recognition. The first march in 1974 drew 20,000 people. Eventually, it became the annual March for Life in D.C. At the risk of stating the obvious, I will point out that this influential pro-life woman, a Roman Catholic who supported a total ban on abortion and the repeal of Roe v. Wade, and who is also credited with popularizing the term pro-life, was not a man, and she attended college. Milano continues, quote, "By the mid-'80s, violent extremists were assaulting women outside of clinics, murdering abortion providers, and bombing their workplaces." End quote. That sounds terrible, and it is, but let's look more closely. Assaulting women outside of clinics. Google that and let me know if you can find any news stories of violent pro-lifers beating up women. I found one of a guy shoving a woman in Denver from 2011. My guess is that Milano must be referring to pro-life demonstrators verbally assaulting women on their way into clinics. But even this was not the norm. Pro-lifers have been primarily about saving babies, not shaming or assaulting women. I used to regularly picket a Planned Parenthood in Kansas City in the 1980s. A primary objective was to offer free alternative services to the women scheduled for abortions: financial support, shelter, adoptive services, emotional support, and so on. The pro-life demonstrators, usually women who referred to themselves as sidewalk counselors, would have to shout to be heard because by law, demonstrators were confined to the sidewalk and were not allowed on clinic property. Additionally, Planned Parenthood had escorts who would walk women from their cars to the clinic door, talking over the demonstrators. One could reasonably argue that this was harassment, though that wasn't the intent. But it certainly was not violent extremists assaulting women outside of clinics, and it was never just men. Next, Milano accuses violent extremists of murdering abortion providers and bombing clinics. This certainly did happen, and Milano is correct in saying these are the acts of violent extremists. Here are the numbers for the 49 years since Roe was decided. 11 murders. The first shooting occurred 20 years after Roe v. Wade. 42 bombings of clinics. With a couple of notable exceptions, the motive of these after-hours bombings seems to have been to stop abortions rather than to harm workers. I was able to verify one early morning bombing that occurred when staff was present in Atlanta in 1997. No staff members were injured. I point this out not to justify the fire bombings, which I absolutely denounce, but to correct the false impression that clinics were routinely being blown up with people inside. Interestingly, even in the male-dominated field of shootings and bombings, at least 6 of those 42 bombings were carried out by one woman, Shelley Shannon. Shannon spent 25 years in prison for shooting and wounding an abortionist and firebombing clinics in several states. Abortion violence has never been condoned by mainstream pro-life organizations and is always condemned when it happens. The unlawful taking of a human life contradicts the pro-life ideal of the sanctity of all human life. Most pro-lifers have a religiously grounded belief that every human being has inherent value and dignity. This belief moves them to act on behalf of new human life in the womb, but also prevents them from taking the lives of abortion providers. Finally, the video closes with this statement, quote, "History tells us that this was never about abortion. It's about human rights. Centuries of men telling women what we can and can't do with our bodies." End quote. Milano and the writers of this video are simply incorrect. History does not support their story. It has always been about abortion. For both women and men, the pro-life movement has always been based on the biological fact that a new human life begins at conception. This was true back in 1857 when the AMA first moved to criminalize abortion, and as medical science has progressed, that pro-life basis has only been affirmed. This is what is behind the pro-life movement. Tellingly, throughout the entirety of Milano's video, the developing fetus is never mentioned. The fact that a new human life begins at fertilization means that every pregnancy involves at least two bodies, the mother and her developing offspring. A sperm cell by itself and an ovum by itself will never become anything else. But when these two unique sex cells, each bearing 23 chromosomes, combine, a new, living, genetically complete and genetically unique human life is formed, complete with 46 chromosomes and his or her own gender, beginning a dynamic growth process. One may argue that many of these new lives will spontaneously abort, but this doesn't change the biological fact that the beginning point of each new human life is the event of conception. Abortion is the deliberate act of ending a developing life in utero. That is what the pro-life movement is opposed to. By the time a woman typically suspects she is pregnant, that process is well underway. It is no longer a simple issue of a woman deciding what to do with her own body. Milano is correct in saying that this is about human rights. It's just that she is denying the existence of one of the human parties involved. If we as a society do not protect human life at its most helpless and vulnerable point, then when do we decide human life is worth protecting? Our only other option is to arbitrarily assign value for subjective utilitarian reasons like wantedness, fitness, independence, intelligence, ability, usefulness, sentience, age, race, sex, health, or some other subjective point. All of these turn out to be ethically problematic in determining who lives and who dies. Having said all of that, it is understandable how Alyssa Milano and women like her feel that men want to control women. History is full of examples of men treating women badly, and the world is full of controlling and manipulative men. There is no shortage of men being sexually irresponsible, coercive, or just oblivious. Pro-lifers need to take care to speak up and act on behalf of women. We need to acknowledge that a pregnancy is a major life event. We must recognize that there are pregnancy-related conditions that can be fatal to a pregnant mother, that birth control frequently fails, that many women and girls feel trapped in unhealthy or abusive relationships, and that homicide is a leading cause of death for pregnant women in these situations, and that there are many fetal abnormalities that are usually fatal to the baby before, during, or shortly after birth. The point is that there are legitimate concerns on both sides of the abortion debate. Extreme positions don't make for reasonable public policy. Must our only two choices be a total abortion ban versus unrestricted access to abortion up until birth? We need honest conversation about how to balance a pregnant woman's rights with those of her unborn offspring. A false narrative about a centuries-long conspiracy of men bent on controlling women's bodies hinders that conversation. There is nothing else like pregnancy. Pregnancy is not a disease, and a fetus is not a tumor or a parasite. We do know what causes pregnancy. Can we even agree to work toward creating a culture of life? A culture of life where women don't feel they must choose between their child and abortion? A culture where men step up and care enough to be sexually responsible? A culture that celebrates the singular and uniquely feminine contribution that women make to society, rather than viewing pregnancy as a liability for women? Like, subscribe, and please share with people who you think will give it some thought.